The Scottish wildcat is our last remaining native cat species in this country. We've persecuted the northern lynx to extinction, and so the Scottish wildcat is it. It's the last one. We need to do what we can to help it. And it's almost like the 11th hour now because they are so endangered. So we have to pool all our resources together from many different angles to save this special animal, this special cat. Now, the Scottish wildcat is believed to be, weight for weight, the most aggressive cat species in the world. It's also believed to be perhaps the only cat species that is truly untamable.
I think their reputation for an untamable nature just really highlights that they are different right to the core from our domestic cats. So a domestic cat that's been neglected or not used to humans at all can usually be gradually brought round to trust humans over time. Whereas a wildcat, you know, for 8,000 to 9,000 years at least, has been a wild animal and is never really going to entirely trust humans.
Scottish wildcats tend to be larger than domestic cats are. They are more stockily built, longer in the leg as well, broader, flatter muzzles, more defined markings on the side of their bodies as well. To look at, perhaps arguably the biggest difference between a Scottish wildcat and a domestic cat will be their tail. A Scottish wildcat's tail is slightly shorter, it's a lot thicker, a lot bushier, usually 4 or 5 black dark rings. They also behave differently in the way they move and act. Scottish wildcats, they don't walk, they tend to stalk everywhere. They don't look at you, they have that stare in their eyes as if they're peering into your soul, something eerily beautiful about them.
So wildcats also behave differently to domestic origin cats. So, for instance, we know they use the landscape differently, we know they're more nocturnal and so forth. Another difference is the fact that they only breed once a year, whereas domestic origin cats can breed several times a year. So there are subtle differences like that in behaviour as well as appearance.
Now, the Scottish wildcat is a very elusive, a very secretive animal. They tend to spend most of their life on their own as well, and so it's very unlikely that you'll ever see one out in the wild. They're adapted in so many ways to exploit the habitats that they find in. So, for example, their coat, their pelage is ideal, almost perfect for camouflage.
Scottish wildcats are ambush hunters, and they're typically found on edge habitats, so they're not necessarily found in the dense pine plantations, but they are on the mixed woodland. And in that transitional areas, you'll get animals moving from forest to open grassland. They know exactly where to hunt, they've got their techniques and are able to catch, for a small cat, relatively large prey.
Now, the Scottish wildcat is a purely carnivorous animal, and so they'll mainly be preying on smaller mammals and the game birds that they find within their natural home ranges. Staple diet would probably be something like rabbits and hares, for example. They are stocky animals, although they're fairly small for a cat species or a wild cat species. They are stocky, they are long-legged, so they are quick and agile hunters. They can climb trees to many feet high, 40, 50 foot up a tree. An accurate population of Scottish wildcats is very difficult to come up with, and you'll talk to different people and they'll give you different answers. So from the captive breeding side of things, I think the official number that our group will say is there's probably only as few as 35 pure Scottish wildcats left in Scotland, and so they are in desperate need of our help.
It's always difficult to count a population that exists in really low numbers of any mammal, but it's particularly difficult with wildcats because they're so elusive, they're naturally very, very shy. Not only are they quite nocturnal, but they're also just really sneaky. The way they move through the landscape is very much sticking to cover, taking routes that allow them to sneak around without coming out into the open too much.
I mean, you could argue with rewilding, as many people do, why bother? What's the point? It's a long-term, expensive process. And I would answer that question with another question, and that is, you know, what's the alternative? We have ongoing species loss, we have ongoing habitat fragmentation, climate change, of course, is accelerating. We are in danger as a species of losing our basic life support system. A key word in this whole process is connectivity. We have a very fragmented landscape here in Scotland. We need to really be thinking about connecting individual fragments of native woodland, for example, to allow the free movement of species like crested tits, red squirrels, wildcats, who need these wildlife corridors to recolonise areas where in some cases they've not been seen for decades, even centuries. And in Scotland, there are lots of very exciting examples of both private land holdings and public land holdings really starting to look at restoring the landscape on a big scale. And here in the Cairngorms is a really good example where you've got public bodies and private landowners working together to restore the integrity of landscape across land ownership boundaries. So in many ways, we're entering a new era in nature conservation, and it's exciting.
The wildcat's incredibly iconic in Scotland. It's culturally, it's an incredibly important species. It's at the top of the food chain. It's woven into the history of Scotland with the Highland clans, and it's a critically endangered species. Many Scottish clans would use the wildcat as their clan logo, and they did this because they can obviously recognise the ferociousness and the independence and the strength in one relatively small cat, but that had such a big character and was so very iconic. And it's important that animals like the wildcat, they have their place in history, they have their place in culture, and I don't think there's any stronger than the wildcat.
Wildcats were historically persecuted and were only given legal protection in the 1980s, which is quite recently. Since then, things have improved a lot, but we're still finding that occasionally they get accidentally killed by gamekeepers and pest controllers. But since they were legally protected, they have really been suffering from a combination of more difficult things to solve, which are things like hybridisation with domestic origin cats, and disease, of course, transferring from unneutered and vaccinated feral cats and pet cats to the wild cats. Hybridisation is sometimes called crossbreeding or integration. It's where animals of different genetic origin cross. And in this case, we've got Scottish Wildcats crossbreeding with cats of domestic origin. So thousands of years of separate development, suddenly they get crossed over. And why that's a problem is that every time that happens, the genes are diluted and all those features and adaptations that make a Scottish Wildcat special get diluted down and are gradually lost. So as well as changing in appearance, it's losing some of those advantages that help it do its job in the environment and survive out here. We have to figure out which cats are wildcats, which cats are hybrids. And in reality, there's a scale. There's pure wildcats on one end and domestic cats on the other. We do use a combination of techniques to decide which cats are hybrids and what degree of hybrid they are. So we use a system called pelage scoring, which is based on their appearance, and a system of DNA analysis, so genetic work. So we're just checking the SD cards from the cameras we visited today. So these are the cameras we've got placed out in locations where we're monitoring cats, both wild cats and feral cats. This is ideal because it shows us so many different features of the cat. So we've got his tail shape, we've got the shape of the bands here, we've got the extent of the dorsal line. He's also got very distinctive leg stripes. So when I'm trying to figure out an individual, the fact he's got one really thick one and two narrow ones and a third angular one, that's the kind of thing I can compare to other cat videos and images. Okay, so our target animals are feral cats, so that's cats of domestic origin, and very obvious quality hybrids that we want to catch for neutering and vaccination and returning back to where they came from. So the idea is that we use cameras first to figure out where cats are and to figure out if it's safe to trap. So we find wee spots in the woods and fields where it's safe to tuck one of these in out of the way, out of the weather, and cats, being curious, come along, look for our food and scent, and wander in, hopefully. But it takes a lot of preparation and quite a bit of a knack as well. We have surveyed the whole area with cameras at about one camera every 1.25 kilometres last winter with volunteer help. From that, we got a fairly good idea of what cats were living where, and we knew which areas were most likely to have ferals. So this autumn, we came back to those feral hotspots, put cameras out again, confirmed that there were ferals there, and then put the traps live. So the trap sites, the cage trap sites, were chosen based on sort of up-to-the-minute sightings of ferals. So we always make sure we know exactly what we're targeting. And if there's a wildcat around as well, we have to take extra precautions. If there was a female with kittens, we wouldn't be able to trap. If you've got, for instance, badgers coming every night, it's just too risky, you have to move it. And as well as all of that, you also have to make sure you've let all the neighbours know, because they might have pet cats that you could accidentally catch. So I've leafleted every house within a couple of miles of each trap site to let people know what dates we've been trapping, what's involved, how to keep their pet cat separately, and ask people to give me a photograph or a description of their cat. So that if I accidentally catch them, I go, oh, it's you, and let it go. So we check all our feral cat traps every 12 hours. So it's at least twice a day, sometimes even more frequently than that, particularly if you have multiple cats that might trigger the trap.
I got a letter through the door about the scheme they were doing round about this area. I contacted her and told her the story. I've got 3 kittens and they needed neutering. So she offered to do it through the Wildcat Trust, free of charge, because we're in a prime wildcat area.
That's something we're doing on an ongoing basis, and trying to do more of is educate the local community in the part that they can play. The biggest and simplest thing people can do is simply get their own pets neutered and vaccinated, which is good for their pet, but it also helps protect local wildcats. So it's those kind of messages we take to, community events in the summer, to local school groups and scout groups and so on and so forth, and doing more and more targeted campaigns for local farmers, and local residents in real wildcat hotspots. So working away at it, just trying to spread that message as much as we can.
In Scotland, we still have a unique population that's separated from the European, and they provide an incredibly important role in the wild. So that's a population that we want to maintain, we want to conserve. We have over 20 conservation-focused organisations as partners, coordinated by Scottish National Heritage, backed by the government. So really, in a nutshell, it's the most effective plan to date nationally for Scottish wildcat conservation.
So here at the British Wildlife Centre, we are part of a nationwide group, the Scottish Wildcat Conservation Action Group, where we are actively breeding Scottish wildcats every year, which will hopefully and potentially be released into the wilds of Scotland in the near future. We want to try and keep them as pure as possible. So that's not only pure as a species, but also pure as a subspecies that has been separated from mainland Europe as long as the Scottish wildcat has been. Centres such as ourselves can play a vital role in the conservation of Scottish wildcats from many different angles. Of course, actively participating in breeding these animals. And here at the British Wildlife Centre, we have 1 or 2 litters a year to then be able to breed enough pure Scottish wildcats to eventually go back out into the wild in a few years' time to sustain our last remaining native cat species in this country.
So in order for us to take cats from a captive environment and prepare them for release, we would have to put them through a lot of different management practices that we have here in collections. And by that, it's to ensure that cats want to avoid humans. Then we also have to make sure that the cats have the right hunting strategies. It's one thing putting a cat out there that can catch a live animal in a captive environment, even if it's off show to the public, but it's a different one where a cat has to, over a period of hours or days, track and hunt animals and then to physically catch them and restrain them.
People have asked me, what would it matter if we lost Scottish wildcats? Haven't we got, feral cats that will just do the same job? And actually, that's not true. Wildcats do fill a unique niche in our environment, and if we were to lose them, it would have flow-on effects for other species. And I think the Scottish countryside would definitely be less of an interesting and wild place without the Scottish wildcat.